things with an interest in criminology, and so this book is in general is a book about capital punishment, but they wrote the chapter from the Jewish perspective. And it brings up a lot of the things that I was thinking about mentioning anyway. I also managed to get the second vaccine this weekend. So that's really exciting. Thank you. So if I turn green or anything during the class, you'll know why. But so far, thank God I haven't had any negative side effects.
Which vaccine did you get? The Moderna?
Moderna, yeah.
Okay, good. Good for you.
Thank you. Excellent. So, does anybody want to read a little bit?
I'll do it.
All right, go for it.
Introduction. The Torah, also referred to as the 5 books of Moses, the scripture, or in the Christian world, the Old Testament, provides a comprehensive account of law and punishment, including the use of the death penalty for a wide variety of offenses. Before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 1 AD, the death penalty was imposed by the Jewish courts in line with biblical authority. But since those ancient times, Jewish law has been anti-capital punishment in orientation and practice. It was before, too. Yet populist demands for the imposition of the death sentence nowadays are more often than not grounded in the biblical authority of the Old Testament. At pro-death penalty rallies, for example, television cameras zoom in on placards quoting biblical verses, often inappropriately co-opted without a proper understanding of the context and rich jurisprudence, which underscores Jewish law's disavowal of the death penalty. The consensus of Jewish law scholarship, representing the full spectrum of religious observance, is that claiming biblical support for capital punishment distorts the attitude of Jewish law to capital punishment, which in principle and certainly in practice relatively quickly turned its back on the death penalty. There are various rationales for this position, but the core consideration is that Judaism is opposed to the taking of human life. This stricture even extends to preserving the life of someone who has committed a serious crime for which the death penalty is theoretically a sentencing option. We argue that Jewish law's stance on capital punishment demonstrates the reluctance, even the abhorrence, of Jewish courts and judges to the death penalty. In Jewish law, capital punishment remains a symbolic representation of power foregone rather than exercised. There is humility in the Jewish position on capital punishment, and an awareness that human institutions are imperfect and so cannot be trusted to inflict the ultimate sanction, which should be left to God.
All right, so let's stop there for a second and just discuss, and then we'll continue. So, even in today's day and age, there are Jewish courts. So 3 rabbis who are well-trained have the power to rule in certain things. But the Jewish courts of today are nothing compared to what they were when the Jews had autonomy and in ancient times. And then, of course, there's the modern state of Israel, which I'll talk about also. But this is just to give it some context. Let me bring it up the next part. All right, Shelley, you want to do one more paragraph?
Sure. In this chapter, we begin by outlining the scope of the death penalty in the Torah, noting the crimes deemed punishable by death and the forms of execution advanced in the sacred text. We go on, however, to explain that, as with the common law system, Jewish law is an oral tradition in which successive authoritative interpretations and commentaries have codified the law as a living legal, moral, and spiritual system. We then review the acknowledged position of Jewish law on the death penalty, demonstrating that quite quickly a raft of procedural and substantive prerequisites for conviction in capital cases rendered the imposition of the death penalty difficult, if not impossible. We conclude with a discussion of the place of capital punishment in contemporary Israeli society, highlighting the symbolic significance of forbearance and restraint in the policies of punishment.
Thank you. So just the reason that we're studying this now is because in this week's Parsha, this coming week reading, the Parsha is Mishpatim. Mishpat means justice. Shofet means judge. And so this is, after the giving of the Ten Commandments, then it was the expanding and giving specific laws, including some things for the death penalty. I think the first one that's mentioned is murder, which seems like the most obvious one. All right. Does somebody else want to read a little bit?
I'll read a little.
Thank you. And if the baby monitor disturbs you, just tell me. I'll shut it off.
No problem. Biblical capital offenses and modes of execution. According to biblical law, capital punishment applies to a wide range of offenses that can be loosely grouped into three categories. The first category is religious offenses, such as desecration of the Sabbath, for which the death penalty constitutes the marker of the severity of the sin. The penalty, however, was progressively not imposed by courts because this and other religious offenses are fundamentally a sin against God, and so it is for God rather than man to exact punishment. To do otherwise would be to usurp the rights of God. The second category of capital offenses is crimes against the laws of decency and family integrity. These offenses included, for instance, the crimes of incest and adultery. The final category of crime are those which simultaneously breach divine law and seriously disrupt social order, such as premeditated or deliberate murder. By contrast, accidental murder, or what we term manslaughter, was punishable by exile rather than by death. The gravity of the offense also gave rise to different modes of execution, partly to signify the requisite degree of opprobrium for particular crimes. A system for categorizing capital crimes was developed by the renowned 12th century Jewish scholar Maimonides, who lists 36 crimes that attract the death penalty in the Bible and classifies these offenses according to the four modes of execution nominated in the Bible: stoning, burning, strangulation, and beheading, or slaying.
Yeah, so the attitude seems to be that the death penalty was there more as a deterrent than as a practical tool to be used. I mean, we know just from the biblical account that it was used to some degree. The question is to what degree. And then the other thing is that there's four different methods of executing somebody, which are a little bit vague in exactly what they are, and so they've evolved, as we'll read. And the idea being, according to Maimonides, that they were meant to reflect the severity of the offense. And so, is a stoning death worse than having your head chopped off? I suppose. You might live longer. I don't like to think about these things too much. But that seems to be the indication that one is chosen. One is more severe than the next. All right, Lenora, can you go a little more?
Sure.
All right. So we start off with stoning.
Okay.
There we go.
Stoning was probably the standard form of judicial execution in biblical times and is often expressly prescribed as the mode of execution. As the survival of publica, it's hard for me to see that, whatever. It was categorized in the early Judean period by the active participation of the wider community. The offenses punishable by burning were confined to adultery in specified categories of family relationship, such as between a man and his wife's daughter, and the adultery by the daughter of a priest. Burning was an independent method of execution, but was also used to aggravate the punishment of stoning by burning the corpse after execution. Punishment by strangulation applied to kidnapping of a fellow Israelite, false prophesying, and I'm saying that incorrectly, and I'm sorry, anybody want to help me with that? I can't. Prophesying? No. In the name of another deity. Adultery not captured in the family relationship specified in the Serapha category, wounding one's own parents, and insubordination before the grand court by a sage. Beheading or slaying, hereg, applied to only two categories, according to Maimonides: unlawful premeditated murder and being a member of a city that has gone astray. In addition to Maimonides' classification, hanging is also mentioned in the Bible as a method of execution, and certainly it figures as an extra-legal or extrajudicial measure in parts of the Bible. The apparently long list of capital offenses described in the Torah is still not as extensive as the crimes which constituted the so-called Bloody Code of 18th century Jewish law, which included relatively
18th century English law.
English law. I'm sorry.
That's
English
okay.
law, which included relatively minor theft offenses. The biblical methods of execution appear from a modern perspective cruel. However, in practice, these modes of execution were progressively moderated by approaches that effectively minimized the pain to the offender as well as to the defilement of his body. For example, while hanging the deceased after execution on a stake was used as a form of general deterrence, the body was kept on public display only until nightfall, at which time it had to be buried. For a hanged person is an affront to God.
All right. Does anybody else want to take over?
I could take over.
Thank you, Sharon.
All right. This one's a little bit more tricky.
Weird.
Let's see if you can get it.
Okay. Successive modifications to the mode of capital punishment were grounded in two biblical injunctions. The first was the requirement to love thy neighbor as thyself, which was held to extend to criminals. To love the convicted felon in practice meant giving him the most humane, beautiful death possible. The second rationale was that the judicial death should, as far as possible, resemble the taking of life by God. That is, the body should remain externally unchanged, as in the case of a natural death, and should not be mutilated or destroyed. Such modifications are evident in the replacement of public stoning by a closed house of stoning, a two-story building from the top of which the convicted was pushed by one of the witnesses at his trial. It was expected that the fall would result in the.
So did you guys catch the difference there? I'm sorry. So stoning, at least what comes to my mind right away is a bunch of people throwing stones at somebody. And that was changed or interpreted however, but either way, it ended up becoming dropping a person from a two-story building. Again, not something very attractive, but was seen as closer to meeting these needs of keeping the body more intact, and the other one of loving thy neighbor, where it was seen as less.
Okay, I'll continue. If the fall failed to cause the condemned man's death, then the second witness at the trial against him was required to cast one stone directly at his heart. As well as completing their execution, it was believed that this requirement, that witnesses cast the stone themselves, would deter witnesses from giving false evidence by imposing direct responsibility for the death on their shoulders. Only if both the fall and the single hit efforts failed would the whole community participate in the stoning. As it is said, the hand of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death. Continue. Sadly, over time, burning was transformed into a punishment that was more akin to strangulation than burning. They will immerse the offender in mud and wrap a cloth around his neck, and each one of the executioners pull until he opens his mouth, and then a wick is to be lighted and thrown into his mouth. The rationale for this substitute method was, again, the need to preserve the body intact. Both opinions expressed in the Talmud analogize the punishments with instances in the Bible where burning was carried out from heaven. The stories of Korach and Aaron's sons both ended with the offenders being burned by God in a way which the Talmud states left their bodies intact. Whether strangulation by cloth is easier or involves less suffering than hanging is a moot point. The salient issue is that despite the requirement to impose prescribed forms of capital punishment, the most humane form of death continued to preoccupy Jewish scholars, who sought to protect the dignity of the convicted while complying with the spirit of the law. Such sensibilities were a feature of Jewish punishment practice millennia before Foucault's disturbing account of the gruesome public spectacle of the execution and the infliction of pain on the body of the accused in 18th century France. With the passage of time, changing social structures and political and economic needs also brought changes to the way in which capital punishment was administered and implemented. But any change to the dictates of God's law, as appearing in the Torah, could be regarded as a challenge to their perfection and timelessness. The dilemma was solved by the recognition of the oral Torah, which simplified and explained the written Torah.
All right, one more.
Okay, to appreciate the position of Jewish law and jurisprudence on capital punishment thus requires going beyond the blunt statements in the scriptures. It requires an understanding of the capacity of Jewish theology to reconcile the scriptures with their authoritative interpretation by scholars over time, as well as with the practical administration of justice.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip this section, but just summarize it quickly because it's things that we've talked about in the past. And basically, it goes to the authority that the rabbis have, right? So we have the written Torah, which seems like that should be the authority, and we should follow it to the letter. But what we know is that Moses was camped out on the mountain for 40 days. And it doesn't take 40 days to tell Moses the 10 Commandments. So what was Moses doing up there? So the traditional belief is that Moses was being taught a whole lot more, and even more than what was written only in the 5 books of Moses. Even more than the prophets and the writings, but also a whole rich tradition of explanation for the commandments. And so when the rabbis changed or modified what seems explicitly written, they did it based on that tradition, based on what they were taught by their teachers, who were taught by their teachers. And this is known as the oral law because it wasn't written down until basically from when we start counting. right around the time of the beginning of Christianity. So until that point, the Mishnah, the Talmud, was not written down. And the Talmud was only written down about 600 or so, the year 600 or so. All right. Hi, Roy. Somebody else want to take over?
Well, I'm sorry?
No, hold on.
I'm here. Okay. I'm here.
I was saying hi.
Okay.
Hey.
Yeah. I was confused about the link to go on because the Worldwide Rap had their own thing going on now.
The Worldwide Rap thing is finished.
No, they have an 11 o'clock lecture.
Oh, okay.
So I was confused so I went through my email on links and wasted time with that, so that's why I'm late.
Sorry. Well, we were just basically talking about the introduction. The class is about capital punishment.
Okay.
Because that's in this week's parsha coming up in Mishpatim.
Okay.
All right. The demise of capital punishment. Does anybody else want to read? Roy or Sandy, are you able to?
I'll read, I guess. Capital cases induced a sense of awe, anxiety, and fear in Jewish judges because a life was at stake. Myman Fishman, 1938 through 9, page 146. Jewish law has an overriding belief in the sanctity of human life because man was created in the image of God. Genesis 1:27. The sanctity of life is the most cherished value in Jewish law, and adherence to the fundamental value distinguishes it very clearly on from the laws of other ancient nations. For example, Greenberg, 1976, Johnson, 1988. The conviction that there is not any nation so great that has statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, Deuteronomy 4:8, was asserted in the Torah itself. The sanctity.
Roy, just one second.
Okay.
So I disagree with that slightly, because idolatry was seen as not serving other gods, or certainly not leading others to serve other gods, was seen as a higher principle, and people would lose their life for it. So, but overall, there's only 3 mitzvot for which a person is said. What do we got now? Okay. So where a person is said to die and not. My brain froze for a second, and not. Disregard the law or break the law. Okay. All right. Looks like Roy's phone was ringing in the background there. All right. I'll read a little until he gets back. The sanctity of life is so central to Jewish law that it justifies even the desecration of the Shabbat. Roy, whenever you're ready, you can take over again.
Okay. Can't wait. The sanctity of life is so central to the Jewish law that it justifies even the desecration of Shabbat, or Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish religion, to treat a 100-year-old person whose death is imminent, even if the treatment will only prolong his life by a single hour. Trikei Yoma 85a, Shulchan Aruch 329 4, Ber Halacha 329 4. The value of life.
Just one more interruption. Sorry, Roy. Although that's a general principle in modern medicine, where we're prolonging people's lives with all kinds of artificial means, machines and otherwise, that principle is not as strong as it used to be. Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, but I would still think that saving somebody's life, even if you have those machines and stuff, is still more important than even Yom Kippur, I would assume.
Right, but the reason I'm saying that is because when it comes to, for example, turning off, extubating somebody, turning off machines, or making healthcare decisions, or, to be a DNR or not, whether to resuscitate, there's a lot of debate. So the old principle was that we kept somebody alive no matter what.
Okay.
Even if it was, medically futile or, all of that. But rabbis are starting to come around to the reality that that's not always necessarily the spirit of the law.
If somebody is brain dead,
Right.
but the respiratory system is still working, and somebody has a DNR, what is that in halacha right now?
So there's a debate. There's a debate with whether brain death or the heart stopping should be considered death. Rabbi Tendler has been the proponent for brain death being the criteria, which is the more modern view in medicine.
And what's Rabbi Tendler's background?
He's Litvish. Others go by what traditionally, before there was CPR, before there were these machines, it would stop breathing and their heart stopped and meant they were dead. Except now we know that we can actually bring people back sometimes. So they're not so dead. So it gets tricky, and that can be a class in itself. But I just wanted to just make that one point before we go too far off. All right, keep going, Roy.
The value of life is no measure or gradation. The life of the very old or the very young, the happy or miserable life, all equally worthy. Tikhozinski, 1963, page 36. The primacy of this value means that it required enormous confidence and wisdom for a court to determine to deprive a man of his life. Well, a murderous a court to kill one person in 70 years was considered a murderous court. But yet, the Torah has lists as capital punishment for things that, by modern standards, are very, very small infractions. Being killed for violating Shabbos, for example.
Hold on. Are you reading or speaking? I'm
speaking.
I lost where you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was speaking. I was saying that. I had said that a court was considered a murderous court if it killed one person in 70 years, but yet the Torah prescribes capital punishment for what in modern sensibilities would be relatively mild infractions, whether it's violating Shabbos.
Exactly, and that's the tension of this article. It'll get to it.
Okay,
you're right there.
Okay, the Talmud tells us that the imposition of the death penalty ceased with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 1 AD, the event that marked the beginning of the exile of the Jewish people and the loss of their political independence. Effectively, the courts lost, or rather surrendered, their criminal jurisdiction. The reason advanced in the Midrash is that when the Sanhedrin, the Hebrew High Court, could no longer hold its sessions in a regular location, in a precinct of the temple called Lishkat HaGazet, it was deprived of the benefit of the sense of justice and righteousness which a temple inspired. Sanhedrin 41a, Ben Zimra, 1962, page 12.
Yeah, well, you don't have to read the sources.
Okay.
All right, keep going.
This jurisdictional abrogation derives from the verse of the Torah. If a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him with mine altar, that he may die. I just want to read it.
So that's actually from this week's Parsha. And it's a fascinating line because it seems sort of like a tangent. The issue is if somebody murders somebody, what the punishment should be. Why does it say that you should take him from my altar? So he's going to advance, the two she's that are the authors of this article, are going to advance one explanation. I found another explanation for this which is fascinating, which is that in ancient times, the same way there were cities of refuge in the Torah for somebody who kills by accident, in ancient times, there were certain places that were considered holy and sort of a timeout, a safe space, including temples, that if somebody went in there, you couldn't hurt them. The rule somehow didn't apply. The holiness of the place didn't allow that. And so people would go and run, if they killed somebody and they knew that people were going to come for them, they'd go and run and grab onto a temple. And we actually see that happening with one of the sons of King David. When he tried to become king before Solomon, he ran to the temple and held on, and the generals were like, "We don't know what to do." And then I think
there was no temple. There was no temple yet.
Correct. You mean at this point?
Yeah, at the point when, if you're talking about one of King Solomon's half brothers, Solomon built a temple, so there's no temple yet.
There wasn't the temple, but there were temporary places of there was Shiloh, there were other places. There wasn't the official temple. All right, let's keep going.
Okay. This verse is interpreted to mean that capital punishment can only be imposed on the auspice of the altar, that is, only valid while the temple existed. The second related rationale for this abrogation of jurisdiction, once the temple was destroyed, derives from the biblical verse, "And thou shalt come unto the priests and the Levites and unto the judge," Deuteronomy 17:9. Interpreted to mean that only when there is a priest can there be a judgment in capital cases.
Right, and so essentially what they're saying, I keep going to she. These are two women that wrote this. Is that once the court left the temple, they weren't allowed to give out a punishment of a capital punishment, because the temple gave them the authority to do that, and the interpretation of that line that you take them away from my altar is that the court was near the altar, and that's why you were taking them. They're reading that literally. That's why you were taking them away from the altar. So once the court wasn't at the temple anymore, even if it had everything else about it, it had rabbis and judges that were just as righteous, they didn't have the authority for capital punishment. Keep going.
Thus, a general prescription on the imposition of the death penalty already prevailed in the 1st century AD, or BCE as we like calling it. Some scholars go further to argue that the Sanhedrin chose to go into exile 40 years before the destruction of the temple in order to avoid adjudicating capital cases. The voluntary surrender of criminal jurisdiction is said to have been based on the fact that in those troubled times, lawlessness had increased, and this would have required the court to impose the death penalty in a greater number of cases. However, even before this period of voluntary surrender of jurisdiction, the rabbinical courts were so loath to impose the death penalty that they progressively introduced a host of procedural and substantive requirements which effectively made conviction in capital cases difficult, if not impossible.
All right, thank you. Sandy, you want to go? Looks like you might be at work over there.
Yeah, I am at work, but more important, I'm on my phone. I don't always see it, but I will give it a go. Where are you up to?
Procedural and evidentiary constraints on the death penalty. I can make it a little bit bigger.
Oh, thank you.
Hold on, let me just move it so you're still on the page. I think that's about as big as I can make it on my end.
Okay, I'll Okay. A Sanhedrin that puts a man to death once in 7 years is called a murderer's. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, or even once in 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, if we had been in the Sanhedrin, no death sentence would ever have been passed. Rabban Simeon ben Gamliel said, if so, they would have multiplied murderers in Israel. A modern thought there. This scholarly, and that's the
Well, hold on. So what does Rabbi Simeon and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel mean? Does he agree with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon or not?
I don't think he agrees with them.
Essentially saying that you're taking away the deterrence. If
right.
The whole point of it being there was to deter people from doing horrible things. If people know that they are not going to get the ultimate punishment, then they're not going to be afraid to murder and kidnap and God knows what else. Right.
So even then, well, not even then, but there's certainly no limit to when people really understood human behavior.
Using what?
People understood human behavior.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. So this scholarly discussion took place around 170 AD when the Sanhedrin had been defunct for about 150 years. It is considered to be the most significant rabbinical statement on the issue and well captures the largely abolitionist stance of Jewish law. In this oft-quoted passage, the learned rabbis try to outdo each other in expressing their abhorrence at a judicial process that could end a life.
Right, and this is what Roy mentioned earlier. All right, let me pull it over here. Oop, where'd I go? All right, keep going if you can. It'll jump over. Just give it a second.
Okay.
It's coming.
Okay.
It's stuck in land of the internet. There we go.
By this time, though, it was already rare for criminals to be executed. But Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah exhorts even more sparing use, once every 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva go further still, advocating complete abolition. So the arguments are really not that different today. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel, who was charged with administering the modest degree of self-rule accorded to the Jewish community under the Roman conquest, is the lone dissenting voice. His position echoes the perennial argument of the pro-capital punishment lobby, that capital punishment is the most effective deterrent to crime, and its abolition would lead to an increase in crimes of violence and murder. The deterrence argument is supported by the biblical exhortation, and all those who remain shall listen and fear, and they shall no longer continue to commit any such evil thing among you, from Deuteronomy. Probably for this reason, capital punishment formerly remained a legitimate sentencing option. However, the countervailing biblical injunction for judgment is God's in Deuteronomy stayed the judicial hand and supported the development of the halakha to curtail the application of the death penalty in practice. Effectively, the whole weight of Talmudic scholarship was devoted to radically changing the biblical forms of execution and humanizing them, for they were viewed as obsolete and inappropriate. Amelioration of the harshness of the law was achieved through procedural means, as well as a strict interpretation of the substantive and evidentiary requirements for conviction in capital cases. Very interesting.
All right, we got another couple of minutes, so let's see if we can get to the end of the page, and then we'll see if you guys are interested. We can pick this up next week. Otherwise, we can go with something else. I'll read a little. Procedural hurdles, right? So there were a whole bunch of hurdles that they put in place, which basically made it that it was almost impossible to convict somebody. The adjudication of capital cases required a court of 23 judges. right? So if you didn't have a court of 23 judges at that time, that automatically it couldn't happen. Compared with a bench of just 3 to hear civil monetary matters, civil monetary. The authority for this requirement rested. Thank you, Shel. Where am I? The authority of this requirement rested on the strict interpretation of biblical exhortation: "Do not kill a truly innocent person." Deliberation in capital cases had to commence and be completed during daylight hours. It just brought to mind randomly something I saw last night about one of the president's lawyers, is Shomer Shabbos, and said that he's not going to be able to participate in the impeachment during Shabbos hours. So that should be an interesting how that's going to play out. Anyway, it's neither here nor there, but it just brought it to mind.
Actually, I'm afraid that would be a Chil Hashem.
The whole thing is a Chil Hashem. Chil Hashem means a desecration of God's name. Just
getting back to the truly innocent person.
Yeah.
Now, the word "truly" is an operative term, I would think, in this case.
Right.
Because that actually means that that phrase makes capital punishment more likely, the way I would interpret "truly," because you're saying that a person is, quote, innocent. Are they truly innocent? So that means it makes more people potentially guilty with that term "truly."
Right, and that's the leeway that we have with interpretation. Right. The flip side is you can say truly. Well, you know what? We truly don't. We never fully truly know because we weren't there, and we're using the best tools we have. And one of the major differences between the modern legal systems and the biblical one is that circumstantial evidence is not admissible. And so that limits us even more.
Rabbi, I have a comment on the tone of this book.
Sure.
So just above, the authors seem to indicate that the rabbis mildened what they thought was a too strict point of view in the Bible, that they right. corrected it. And I don't think that is appropriate from the rabbi's perspective. It may be the author's perspective, but I think the rabbis might have thought that this was always in the Torah's perspective. They weren't correcting the Torah in any sense. Sort of like, rather than an eye for an eye, they interpreted that to mean the value of an eye for an eye, but that was always in the Torah. It wasn't, from their perspective, it wasn't that they corrected the Torah. That's what I mean.
Right. And that's the other thing, right? So how much power do the rabbis really have? It is their power that they simply have knowledge that they received from the previous generation, who received it from the previous generation, received it, and they simply are telling it. And you kind of see a lot of that in the Talmud. Often when they present a position, they'll, instead of saying, hey, I think so-and-so, they'll say, I heard from Rabbi so-and-so that it's so. And then there is, the rabbis also have some leeway where they can actually make takanot, where they can make some either changes or adjustments or add new things based on certain situations that either just warrant in either the written Torah or the oral Torah, or there's another principle which I think is in this article as well, if I remember correctly. If not, then I saw it elsewhere, that there are extreme times when, and the line that's used is eight lasot Hashem hefer Toratecha. Basically, desperate times call for desperate measures. The most extreme, the example that they often base that on is Pinchas, in English known as Phineas, who, at least according to the simple reading of the text of his story, there was a plague, people were dropping dead, and some guy went and either took a woman from a nearby land and went into the temple, or exactly, it's a little bit vague exactly what happened. But basically, he said, I need to stop this. He took his spear, stuck it through the two of them, and killed them. And in discussions like this about capital punishment, where we're talking about all these safeguards, it needs to be two witnesses. Another safeguard we'll read about is you need to have warned him or her within a very short amount of time. And not only do you have to warn them, but they also have to acknowledge that they heard you, and they don't care about your opinion, and they don't care about the Torah's opinion, basically. They say, I know that this is a capital offense, and I'm going to do it anyway. Right? And there's even more hurdles, which we'll read about.
The whole Pinchas story, most Orthodox sources applaud Pinchas, but most non-Orthodox sources are appalled by it.
Right, and that's a whole discussion in itself, right? But I think the key part in terms of this aspect is that there are those that are of the opinion that Pinchas actually did have a court case, because it's so inconsistent with these other aspects that they say Pinchas could not have been such a zealot and just gone and done that. There must have been a court case, but the Torah just sped up the story and didn't give us, all the whole blow by blow.
The woman involved, her name was Cosby, actually.
Yeah.
So you can say the Torah prosecuted Cosby much quicker than contemporary society.
Yes. Yes, that's all I can say. So that seems like a good place to end. There's a teaching, I think it's from the Talmud, that you're supposed to start each class off with a joke to open people up, to kind of make them more receptive to learning. So we're doing it at the end instead.
Do we have a minion? Do we have a minion to do?
Unfortunately, we don't. At least I don't think so. No. But do you guys want to continue with this one for next week?
Yes.
Yes? All right, we'll keep going. Yeah, I agree, Shelley, that it's not, if I would have written the tone a little bit differently. But I think they really did a lot of research, and they're hitting a lot of the bases. So that's why I chose it.
Yep. Excellent.
Actually, one last thought, and then for real, I'm going to stop. This question came up, the conservative movement has their own sort of Sanhedrin, if you will, or court. And they ruled on two cases. One is in general, what's their position on the death penalty in Jewish law, and they said that it, in the United States, we wouldn't support it, even though Reb Moshe Feinstein has a famous teshuva ruling where he sent to, I think it was a governor of New York or a mayor of New York, I don't remember, where he supported it in certain circumstances, but that's a whole other thing. And then the other question, which is a more pertinent question, was, does a Jew, as an American citizen, they're called to jury duty, or they're a lawyer, or they're a judge, and they're called to a capital punishment case, do they have an obligation to be a conscientious objector, or whatever terminology you want to use to get out of it.
I thought Dina, but Dina.
Exactly. So on the one hand, there's a principle that says the law of the land is the law, and as long as we don't have our autonomy, we need to follow the law, because otherwise, for the obvious reasons. So that's on the one hand. But then they make arguments on the other hand. It's a really long piece, and I was reading it, and I didn't finish it. I really wish they would give the conclusion at the beginning. but I'm guessing that they come to the conclusion: get out of it if you can, based on what I did read. All right, guys. Hopefully your team wins, whatever team you're following. I have not been following the season. I'm not even sure who's playing, to be honest.
Kansas City and New England. Tom Brady versus Patrick Leonis. So you have the best quarterback of all time versus the guy who is on pace to become the best quarterback of all time.
At least
I'm sorry, Roy. He's with Tampa Bay now, Brady. So it's not New England. It's Tampa Bay.
Yeah, Tampa Bay.
I just said New England.
I might have said that in person habit. Tampa Bay, I meant.
Got it.
Yes.
Rabbi, at least keep the television on so Homeland Security doesn't accuse you of being some kind of an agent,
Right? What kind of American are you?
That's right.
Yeah, we'll get pretzels and beer.
Right.
There you go.
Although some people are...
You too.
Mark Ben Aaron on his Facebook page is boycotting the games. He's been not watching football all year.
A lot of people are
Keep in
not.
mind, Mark Ben Aaron is very, very right-wing politically.
Well, he really should be mourning his father. I mean,
but I think he's over Shaloshim, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure what his boycott is going to do to help anything, but I hear you.
I think he has not watched football all year.
Yeah, okay. Gesundheit.
Sorry for football.
The protest.
I hear you.
Have a good day, everyone. Let's
You
get
too. Take care, guys.
Have a good
Bye. Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Yep.
you.